I'm Liz Cole. I'm the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. And I'm also a faculty member in psychology and women's and gender studies. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today. Thank you for joining us. This is the final episode in our Dear Colleagues series, which has featured experts and leaders providing critical information and insight about urgent issues facing higher education in this current landscape. If you missed any of the previous webinars in our series, we have recordings available on our website. Past events have addressed topics like academic freedom, doing DEI in the current legal landscape, and courageous strategic leadership. They've been really fabulous, and if you're interested, please check them out. We start our events by making a statement about academic freedom. The NCID is committed to uplifting the voices and works of academic experts and higher education practitioners. To do this, we draw upon academic freedoms as outlined in the American Association of University Professors 1940 Statement on Principles of Academic Freedom and Tenure, as well as the University of Michigan's SACUA Senate Assembly Statement on Academic Freedom, and our own institution's Standard Practices Guide on Freedom of Speech and Artistic Expression. And I believe that we're going to be posting links to those policies in the chat if you're interested. Some of the perspectives expressed during this event might differ from those of NCID or the University of Michigan, and we present a forum on these perspectives to deepen and also broaden our knowledge of the subject matter. Now, I think, as we're all aware, in the past few months, new federal policies have resulted in the cancellation of research grants, the termination of outreach programs, and the shrinking of the federal workforce in scientific offices. All of these changes have severely narrowed pipelines and career pathways for the next generation of scientists. We've also seen the proposal, and in some cases the institution, of policies that are justified by scientific misinformation, such as those pertaining to access to vaccines and to the rights of trans people. These changes threaten to reduce equity and access to the STEM fields, and they also limit opportunities to conduct rigorous STEM research that will support equitable policies and practices. So in response, this webinar will explore what those of us in higher education, and I mean that broadly, faculty, administrators, people who want careers in the STEM fields, what all of us can be doing now. And we have a wonderful panel of experts here to talk with us. So let me tell you a little bit about the format. We'll begin with each panelist introducing themselves and then making about 5 minutes of brief remarks. And then I'll pose a few questions to the panel, and we'll save the last 10 minutes for questions from you, the audience. So with that, I will pass things over to Dr. Sean Johnson to get us started.
Yes, hi. So I am Sean Johnson. I'm junior faculty in the Department of Astronomy at the University of Michigan, where I'm also a LSNA Collegiate Fellow at NCID. So my work is in observational astronomy. I use facilities like the Hubble Space Telescope and the Magellan telescopes on the ground to study the gaseous atmospheres around galaxies extending to about 1 million light years beyond where the stars actually exist. That this gas flows into galaxies, stars form, and then they explode and populate the universe with heavy elements like oxygen and carbon. I am a co-PI of the Cosmic Ultraviolet Baryon Survey, or CUBS, and you can guess what city I did my grad school in based on that name, which is a large program on Hubble. And before coming to Michigan as faculty, I was a NASA-funded Hubble Fellow at the Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena and Princeton University. While a graduate student, I worked with an Upward Bound program in Chicago trying to bridge access to intensive science research opportunities for students in high school. And as a postdoc, I worked at the Prison Teaching Initiative, teaching college level math and statistics in state and federal prisons. Since coming to Michigan, I've served as a member of the first college-wide LGBTQ working group here at the university. And so broadly speaking, while doing science, I've tried to help broaden access. And in a lot of the sciences, in many places, that is often thought of as outreach in the sense of, you try to broaden the group of people who are inspired and able to pursue science as a career. And that is one of my passions. But the further along I've progressed in my career, the more I've been concerned about community building within people, within groups who are already practicing science. So this is for current majors, graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. And I think see these as intertwined and necessary parts of sort of keeping the broader access going. Um, this is one of the things that I see as particularly threatened and sort of under the radar in a number of ways under the current administration. So we've seen attacks not just on science as a whole and also funding cuts, but also attempts to curtail activities like affinity groups that are critical to building scientific community for people of many different career levels, and that don't explicitly get federal support. So some of the organizations that I work with, the Association of Universities for Research in Astronomy, or AURA, which runs scientific operations for the Hubble Space Telescope, the JWST Space Telescope, and the flagship observatories in the US, has, for example, stopped affinity groups for queer people and other minoritized groups within the field. And that is at the request of the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and NASA, based on directions from the administration. Not every university has taken similar steps, but organizations that are more dependent on federal funds are very likely to sort of obey almost immediately. I find this particularly concerning and difficult to deal with because it makes it more difficult to build community, which I think is necessary for us to sort of survive and thrive in our careers. It also makes it more difficult to connect with people in other fields, especially outside of the natural sciences, which I view as particularly important if we are to continue to use science as a tool for good and a tool for equity. Because as we all know from the history of the sciences, they're a tool that can be used for increasing equity or for uh, uh, can be abused and misused to increase inequity. And with that, I'll pass it over to Brandon. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Everybody can hear me okay? Uh, First and foremost, expressing extreme gratitude to the NCID for their courage, really, really, and throughout the years, and especially in this current moment, for being able to have this series of conversations when everyone else has largely been quiet. I think you've been a leader for many, many years, and I think this event is demonstrative of that leadership. So thank you for putting this on, and of course for the invitation. Of course, also thrilled to be here on this panel of distinguished scholars. I think where I will kind of talk about who I am and where I am, I'm a computational biologist who studies complex biological systems of various kinds. I think the way my research program kind of interfaces with this question is that I'm a career pivoter. I'm somebody who's taken a kind of a computational and mathematical skill set, and I've walked them into kind of thinking about a bunch of different sorts of problems. And that's forced me to think very carefully about the job that I'm in and kind of why we do the job that we do. Now, what makes me an interesting kind of person to be on this panel is I'm one of these individuals who fundamentally believe that if you love an idea, right, if you love an institution, that you should be one to, to criticize it the most, right? And so I've been called a gadfly and a contrarian in a lot of these spaces. specifically because I love DEI so much and I am a protector of what it actually offers higher education and the professional world. So, for example, like through the years, and this is prior to, the 2024 election, I was one of the people who was suggesting that, yeah, some of the programming in general should be less dogmatic, right? No, you can't promote a hierarchy of oppression. No, you cannot promote pain narratives. No, you cannot guilt monger, right? These are things that were characteristics of a lot of the rooms I was in, and I was making these arguments. But this brings me to why the attacks on DEI are so troublesome and so odd and dangerous. When I would bring these kind of questions up and I would have these conversations with educated and or individuals who trained in this paradigm, right? They were welcome. Meaning DEI spaces, as I've observed them through the years, are some of the most pliable, some of the most flexible, some of the most welcoming and dynamic in all of higher education. Okay. If you ask what DEI programming looks like in 2024 relative to 2014, relative to 2004, looks completely different precisely because this space is not an ideological monolith, Leviathan. That's not what it is. It's a set of people who've been charged about thinking about the world that we're in. Now you go to corporate America or you go to biotech, they're having conversations that no, being disabled does not mean that you can't be a medicinal chemist, right? You go to certain spaces now, even in Silicon Valley or places that we might assume are politically unfriendly to us, they're having conversations about how to accommodate neurodiversity. All of these conversations in all of these sectors of the product of DEI right thinking that arose in spaces just like NCID, right? So even people who criticize higher ed, people who call themselves heterodox or whatever the term is now, right? That we do not have enough ideological diversity, for example, which is something I agree with, right? I believe that I would like to debate more on campuses. That's something I believe. Even if you are an author of that viewpoint, the attacks on DEI actually take away the instrument for you to introduce diverse viewpoints, right? You're attacking the individuals who've been trained to actually think about that problem in particular. Um, so I think this notion that DEI kind of is a monolith that thinks about things one way, I think of course is untrue. And I think the sorts of programming that we've demonstrated through the years are reflective of that. Lastly, the term diversity, of course, right, means many things in many different corners of higher education in particular, but throughout the professional world. But as people know, at the University of Michigan, one of the capitals of the meta science movement, right, there's now a growing set of literature that's analyzing sets of patterns in terms of how the actual profession works. That is, how does kind of institutional pedigree work? And how to kind of whether or not science is valuing theoretical work versus experimental work. How does that actually work? You might have seen this work about the pivot penalty, how scientists who move into different fields get pivots. I think by attacking right DEI language, you are further taking away our instrument to be able to analyze how the entire academy can reflect on ways to make things more inclusive for everyone. And that includes race and ethnicity, and that includes sexual identity, and that includes gender, right? But that also includes whether or not you use method A or method B, right? And I think that is ultimately, as a scholar, one of the things that makes it the most unfortunate. Uh, I'm done, and I will pass it to Karen.
I thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm Karen Martinez Gonzalez. I am the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Puerto Rico. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training. And up until April, I used to be the PI and director of a program that trained Hispanic clinicians on how to do clinical and translational research. And unfortunately, our grant was terminated since we were deemed to be unscientific in our DEI purpose of the program. And in addition to that program that was mostly focused on developing Latino scientists who were working on Latino health disparities, I also, my area of research is on climate health and how disasters related to climate changes are affecting our families and our children. So what I would like to start this conversation talking about is what I've learned through the work on disaster mental health and how disasters affect our mental health. So what we have been working on is on looking at how the concept of psychological stress, which is how you evaluate if you have the resources to deal with what life brings to you. So disasters are unpredictable and they create a lot of stress for families. So when you encounter a situation that is stressful because you don't necessarily have the resources on how to deal with that event, you have to build a new toolbox of new resources that you can use to be able to adapt to the new environment that the disaster has created. So these new situations are a way to learn and are a way to adapt to our environment because you learn new skills on how to solve the problems that are now presented by this new situation. It is very difficult for the families and the children that I work with to live in a world that they feel is always changing, unpredictable, and that we feel that we're always adapting to something new. And for us scientists, that's the world we're also living in. We've been since, here in Puerto Rico, we've been dealing with pandemics and natural disasters way before COVID, but in the sense of the world, the COVID pandemic was already this situation that we had to adapt. We had to look for the new skills that we had to add in our toolbox. So knowing that now we are faced with just another situation that we have to adapt, we have to look for new ways to do our science in this new environment, it is very tiresome. And it may make a lot of you think, this is not worth it. I should quit. I should do something else. But that's the reality of the world we live in. And that's the reality of doing science right now. So if we want to survive, we have to look for ways to adapt. And we have science, we have the evidence, the scientific evidence on how to survive these very uncertain or very unpredictable and sometimes unfair situations, and how to adapt to all of these stressors. And that literature or that science base comes from the disaster literature. So what the evidence shows of how do you deal in post-disaster settings really does show how we can, as a community, come together now and deal with this situation that we're dealing with right now. So what we know we need to do is that we need to promote a sense of security and calm. So everyone here that has a lab or has research teams, as the research leader, we need to think about how do I send a message of security and calm to the researchers, my students, everyone who's working under me. And if you're an administrator or in a leadership position, then definitely you should be thinking about, even if you're feeling very stressed out, and even if you're feeling like there is little hope, there is a way of trying to convey this sense of security and calm, even if you're not necessarily feeling it. And the other aspect that we have learned from the disaster literature is that what is really preventive in terms of mental health effects of natural disasters is social connections and how, as a community, we come together and support each other's. And that if we focus on resiliency of communities and not individual resiliency, then communities can come together and surpass whatever is put in front of them. So in the past, we have been successful in adapting to the threats to our DEI community. We have done it multiple times throughout history, and that's why we're here in this moment, and that's why we are able to keep in mind that no matter the threats and the situations, our values and our mission in terms of serving the communities we serve and amplifying the voices of these communities we serve, if we keep our focus on that value, on that mission, then we will be able to develop these new skills that we have to be able to survive this new situation, because there will be learning, there will be growth, and that will lead us to be able to continue our work and to find, especially what we need right now, is to find the hope that we will, as a community, adapt and move forward. So I think with that, we're going to open it up for the panel discussion.
That's right. So Sean and Brandon, I invite you to turn your cameras on. Yep. And as I mentioned, I have a few questions, and I'm going to make sure that there's room for questions from this great audience. So you've shared some of the challenges that we're facing in the current climate, and I want to name that all three of you talked about how threats to open and inclusive climate and culture are really threats to science itself, and therefore community building is key. I mean, I was really struck by that as a theme across everything you said. In these webinars at NCID, we are always trying to make connections between scholarship and practice, and we try to gear these webinars to sort of making a call to action. So I want to ask you, what can faculty members, researchers, administrators do to increase access and opportunity for people of all backgrounds in STEM disciplines, especially right now? I mean, I feel like that's something we've been asking for many years, but what can we be doing now?
Well, I can start. I think we have so much evidence base on how we can make all the work we do open to diversity, open to diverse perspectives. So we can now just completely forget everything that we've learned throughout all of these years when we've been doing this work. So even if we can't put the word DEI right now in the work we do, that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to practice all that we have learned throughout these years. So my call to action for administrators and researchers is that you continue doing the work that you're doing, and you continue building the community that you have building. And if we need to change the names, if we need to change something about it, that doesn't mean that we can't continue with the mission that we have.
Thank you, Karen. Brandon?
Yeah, I can say a few things here. Excellent question. I appreciate Karen's comments and obviously concur with them. Very, very insightful, as is everything else that was said. The way I see it is what we can do is, I mean, I study evolution, so everything is adapt or die. Okay. Right. You can either sit and cry about it or you can do something about it. And I think we're here because nature did something about it. So now it's our turn. Right. Now, how do you do that? And I think, how does evolution work? It works on it works on diversity. That is how evolution works. And so that means we need to diversify our approaches. Okay. And I think one of the things about attacking, an institution or an idea is they have, to the points that I made earlier, they have underestimated how diverse we actually think about this and the number of ways we can go about, addressing inclusion. Okay. So fine. You don't want me to mention race and ethnicity and, thing. Look, there's a lot of ways I can go about studying in a manner that help the people that need help in this world. I don't need that term. Okay, because I don't need those terms for dogmatic reasons. I'm trying to help people. And if you don't want me so my point is, this is what the charge of a scholar is, to adapt. That's what you're trained for. Okay, so I just look at this as a scholarly challenge in a different scholarly realm And I look at it with excitement, if you will, even if it is unfortunate that I have to do it. And so that's kind of, practically speaking, yeah. So for example, like there's practical things. Anybody that operates in science, one of the underappreciated drivers of all of our effort is international talent. Okay, nobody talks about it. Okay, right, and to the degree to which they are discriminated against, and the degree to which they are, see what I mean? That's not even on most of the DEI things what I just said, but that is absolutely a conversation I've had in these spaces. What I'm saying is supporting them, making sure that they navigate the immigration kind of conversation in a rigorous way. These are practical things that are not on any kind of billboard, but that nonetheless help kind of the diversity and inclusion of our workforce so that we can all succeed.
So I'll jump in on one of Karen's points, which I think I agree with what all you have both said, but I want to point to a challenge that's sort of intrinsic in some of this, which is we do have a lot of research on how to increase access to STEM, how to make sure that people can build community and sort of fully participate in science. And a lot of that research is based in terminology around race, national origin, income levels, education levels of parents, and things like that. And a lot of those terms, or at least a subset of them, are now things that we are not explicitly told not to use, but when submitting a grant, if you use some of it, you're probably going to get, or you're more likely to get desk rejected in a sense, right? And there's a challenge in taking the lessons that we've learned from all of that research, much of which is in psychology, and still applying it without forgetting what it's all grounded in and what it's all for, right? And so I just, while I am very tempted to change the language and I understand the need to, I don't want to change it so much that we start to lose the lessons that we learned.
And I think to that point, Sean, that's really what we really need to be thinking about in terms of, okay, if we are going to change the language, what are the limits? Like, how much can we change it and still do the work that we do? And what change would mean that we are not doing the work that we need to do? But I do think we need to have those conversations. And like Brandon was saying, it is exciting to think that this crisis situation can lead us to have those conversations, because for us here in Puerto Rico, we're a very homogeneous community in a way. We have diversity, but the diversity comes way beyond race and ethnicity. So we are used to thinking about diversity in a very broad sense. And for me, it was frustrating to see DEI initiatives in some places and only hearing race and ethnicity when there's just so much diversity with the communities that we work in.
Thank you. Well, let me move on to the second question. An hour goes by so fast. I want to switch gears a little and ask you to talk about the relationship between STEM research and policy. Many kinds of policies, and off the top of my head, policies related to climate change, systemic racism, disparities in healthcare and health outcomes, the rights and well-being of gender minorities. All these kind of policies need to be rooted in rigorous STEM research in order to be effective, in order to be sound. So I wonder about what kind of opportunities you see for us to continue to use science as a tool for equity. Brandon, you and I have talked about this a lot. Would you mind starting us off?
Oh boy. Yeah, no, I'm happy to and honored to. So let's start with one of the things that well, there's many things that I think you highlighted them. I think healthcare is one of them, which of course we'll get to, and certainly Karen is already a world leader in and can summarize. I talked a bit about the meta science realm, right, which is it's not a new field, but it is one that has grown in prominence over the last decade or so. And what it does is it kind of provides, it puts the actual process of science under a microscope, right, as an institution, and it analyzes kind of like patterns and everything from how individuals are hired, what are the structure of that. One of the things that this great field has done, and I'm actually writing about it now, is that it has revealed that that you know I'm proud of my job. I love my job. I'm proud of the work that I've done, but it probably wasn't a meritocracy that got me here, and it sure as hell wasn't the meritocracy that got most of my colleagues here. Meaning there have been biases at every single level in this field that manifest across, to the point that Karen just made, across demographic types, that manifests. So what I mean is, I think that is and a lot of people that do that work are like computer scientists. I think it's like computer science and information science are some of the fields that have ended up in the meta science realm. And again, University of Michigan being a capital of this field. This now can be directly animated into the manner that we hire and promote, right? What are the types of ideas that we're rewarding? I talked about this pivot penalty where you're penalized for stepping outside your field. We now can be mindful of this, and you bet that these things overlap powerfully with kind of demographic things, right? Right? You can bet that they do, right? So what I mean is that's an example of using technical rigor, statistical rigor, computational rigor to put a lens under this profession and identify patterns that can be kind of can be acted on formally, right, in higher ed circles. So I kept my conversation to higher ed just because I want to. There's a lot of room for others to talk about other things, but that's just kind of one example.
And I may add that, and it might be just because I'm a child psychiatrist, so I'm very used to looking at systems and looking at how systems interact within my patients. But we really need to think everything is about the context in which people are in. So I think trying to find like a yes or no answer, or trying to find like, this is the, this is the recipe on how do we do this. I think that might have put us in a way in the position we're in right now, because this is just very complex and we can't just think that we're going to have all the answers. So as a field, if we're really interested in moving forward, just as Brandon was saying, is how do we really take into consideration complexity? How do we not put people in boxes and that they check that, they comply with this or that diversity? I think we need to move beyond that and just understand that every person comes with their background that includes their race, their ethnicity, how they grew up, what education they have, their experience of what they had for breakfast this morning. Like everything is important when you're talking about the perspective and what people need to grow in academia and in a scientific environment. So I think we should take this as a challenge of how do we actually move it forward from check boxes and from just identifying I am diverse, I'm not diverse.
Yeah, I think the use of scientific methods that deal with sort of, in many fields, quantified versions of bias and things like that can serve as a great example for students who attach to concrete things. But then you can start to broaden that perspective as a general set of things that happen. So like everything we observe in astronomy is subject to bias. You take the same object, you put it further away, and we can't see it anymore, right? There's always observational biases, and we just do our best to correct for them. Teaching that in the more human context can be tough, but it's also built into the history of the field. And so teaching that history and having students read things like interviews with scientists who talked about inequitable lab space distribution among faculty and things like that is just a useful thing to do. And in addition, teaching science is a complicated human process where we try to learn about stuff that's incredibly complicated, and breaking down some of the oversimplifications that people may have learned in middle school, high school, even college, those simplifications existed in the pedagogy for a reason, because it's easier to start simple. But realizing that that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? That there's a lot more to the world that you can explore and learn about, I think is itself a tool for equity. And this is outside my field, but this is particularly coming into play now around the field of gender affirming care and things like that.
Thank you for that. I have one last question before we move it over to our audience. And my last question is about early career scientists. And I was really thinking of them a lot when Karen was talking about the challenge of adapting to constant change, because I feel like they're the ones that are facing the impact of this in the strongest way and have the least experience to deal with it. I'm also thinking about the fact that I find that a lot of early career scholars are drawn to the field for the possibility of trying to create more equity, to um, do work that opens the field to people from more backgrounds. So I wonder what kind of advice you would offer to folks early in their careers, whether they're graduate students, postdocs, early career faculty, um, that they're coming to the field and want to create STEM disciplines that are open, accessible, equitable. In this climate, how can they act on those commitments?
Oh, fine. You, Karen, please.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge that as a society, what we had as this like social contract of what you were getting into when you were getting into academia, it's broken. So I think I as someone who has tenure and has already, achieved a leadership position in academia, I think there's a lot I can help people who are coming up and younger by acknowledging that I have the privilege of having been in a system where I kind of knew the rules, that if I did this and that, I will get to this point. And that's not the environment in which people who are starting out and young people are coming into academia or just in the world in general. So I think we need to acknowledge that it is harder for them because there's even more uncertainty on their part on choosing academia and choosing to come into a field where there's no assurances. You can work really hard and still not make it. And so I do think that for young people, I acknowledge that. I try to embed that in the work I do with like my undergrad students and the medical students and my postdocs in all of the rules that we know, publish and submit grants. All of that is important, but how do we also think about what academia is going to look like in the future, which right now I don't think anybody has an answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can chime in, as with everything what Karen said, just a lot of wisdom. And I think as a recent kind of having recently transitioned into the senior fact, to the established faculty level, I think this is something I think my trainees, I joke when I talk to them about everything. I give them two sorts of advice. I tell them that I'm half cool hip professor and half grumpy old professor, and that's typically the kind of advice that I give for everything. And I'll pick up the cool hip professor is a lot like what you heard from Karen, which is correct, which is it is our responsibility to prepare them for a world different than the one that we have. Flat out. That's your job. If you are not having difficult conversations with your trainees about the way the world is constructed now, relative to the way you had it, you're not doing your job. Okay? And I know it doesn't go in your tenure dossier because our incentive system doesn't make sense. But you still signed on to be a scholar. And the job of a scholar is to prepare other scholars to navigate the world. And that's not me making replicas of yourself. That means creating a world for them to have a good life for themselves. So number one, that's how we do it, right? You actually have difficult and challenging conversations. This upcoming year in my laboratory, this is a theme. How do we tailor the training to the world that we're in and not the one that I have? So that's cool hit professor. Grumpy old professor, okay, says the following. This world, and this is very grumpy and old, this world is not going to be engineered to make things convenient for you. Okay? That's not the way it works. The generation before mine, a lot of my mentors were the very first women and black people, and for example, in tech, and particularly in the quantitative fields, okay, where they're very, 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 very few. Okay? How is it that they complain less than I do? That doesn't even make any sense, right? So what I'm saying is they operated a world far more difficult and they navigated it and they opened doors, right? And so what I'm saying is that pioneering attitude is the one we all now have to have. We might have to re-pioneer things. And that's just the way it's going to be, right? No one's going to make it easy. Doing the right thing has never been easy. It's going to take some sacrifice. It's harder doing the job the way Karen does it than if Karen didn't care about those things. That's just the way it is. Okay? And we have to also prepare our junior scholars to deal with a world that is challenging and one that is not going to be convenient to what their belief system is.
So I'm not quite at Brandon's level at the moment. So I'm still fully in the junior faculty box. And so, I just submitted my NSF career grant, so fingers crossed, right? But it kind of feels like approaching that process, putting in grant after grant, preparing to go up for tenure, at least for a lot of junior faculty, myself included, it kind of feels like you're trying to win the lottery while standing on the deck of the Titanic, watching the iceberg approach, right? And it is still an incredibly privileged position to be in, right? Like I get to study some of the coolest stuff in the universe using the best tools to do it. Some of which are in space, which is just mind blowing. And I think we have a lot to learn from our colleagues in the humanities. So as people in the sciences, medicine, both social and natural sciences, we've benefited from a lot of support from the federal government, and I think it is likely that a large fraction of that is going to go away no matter what we do, at least for a little while. And we're going to go through possibly a transition that is like what the humanities went through over decades in just a few years. And so what I'm trying to do is reach out to them and find out how they dealt with it, how they coped. And in the best cases, the ones who I'm trying to make my sort of mentors, how did they maintain their fields or improve their fields as open and inclusive environments in the process, even as they were dealing with decreases in support at the university and federal levels and political attacks. Like, don't get me started on the NEH and NEA, right?
Well, I see Hamida quoted you, Sean, about winning the lottery while standing on the Titanic. That will stick with me for a long time, and I bet a lot of people here feel that way. Well, we have a question here in the Q&A, and those of you out there, if you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll try to get to them. And I feel like this is a good question for see whether you want to answer as the hip professor or the grumpy old professor, because this is a very norm challenging question. So Levi Klankowski talked about the fact that there's evidence that reducing or removing degree requirements for jobs tends to select people who have the skills for those jobs and even result in better outcomes. And at the same time, it can lead to more diversity because it helps people who've been structurally disadvantaged get considered for jobs they'd otherwise be excluded from. And he calls this a paper ceiling. So how can we push against the culture? And he asks specifically at U of M, but I would say this is everywhere, to break that kind of paper ceiling and think about how all kinds of people can participate in the work that we're doing in universities. That is a challenging question. What do you think about that?
All right. I'll give this one a stab. I think about this question quite a bit. I wrote an article in Fast Company a year ago about a credential-less right science. What would that actually look like? Which is very much in the spirit of this question. And I'm not quite a political anarchist, but I am an intellectual one. I actually formally call myself that. I don't really believe in any of this stuff, and I believe that credentialism is one of the worst and I think it's one of the worst instruments in all of scholarship. Now, of course, right, I think part of the reason why we have it, and I think the propagation of mis and disinformation, of course, is important, right? You want to make sure people know what they're doing. I get all that. I think we understand that. There's a lot of tinfoil hats on YouTube telling you why you get sick, telling you why what have you. But I think unfortunately, what has happened is the opposite. This paper ceiling thing, where uh, we have completely walled off and decided that the only individuals who can opine on anything are individuals with a certain not only set of credentials but a set with a pedigree. I think this is one of the most important frontiers in this entire DEI conversation is how we can kind of how we can actually make science like jazz is, where there are formal institutions where jazz musicians are trained, but you can actually be an excellent person from the street in the community and learn how to play your horn and play. Science doesn't work that way. Name one amateur, name one that's eminent in any scientific field. I challenge anybody. You mean to tell me the only people who can do mathematical biology are the people who did a PhD at one of 10 places? That doesn't make any sense. Right? And yet that's precisely how we built this profession. I think it's an embarrassment, right? I think it's a good example. We've been talking about how a conversation that was not classically DEI, that is absolutely DEI, and we can pivot right towards kind of making that a frontier of what we're doing in this space.
And I think the conversation we need to have is, how do you do that while also ensuring the quality of the work we are doing? And I come from that thinking about physicians. Like, you want to go to a physician that someone has stated has the knowledge and skills to do X procedure. So you do need a system that certifies that that physician, has the knowledge and skills to do that. But then how do I do that while opening it up for people who might not have the opportunity to enter the system that offers that knowledge and skills?
Yeah. No, let me just quickly jump in there. No, that's exactly right. That's a real challenge, and one we have to think carefully about, because what you're saying is 100% right. But as you know, some of the worst weaponizers of misinformation are people with credentials.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Right? As we've
Mm-hmm.
learned. And so so credentials isn't actually isn't actually the proper sieve. Right? You look at I'm just reading about the amyloid thing in Alzheimer's. Basically, we just wasted billions of dollars and completely built a research cartel with some of the most esteemed people in the world establishing mafia over a hypothesis that at best is only a part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning we got a lot of problems that people with credentials authored, right? So while what we're seeing, what Karen said is 100% right, what I will argue is that credentials have not fixed that problem. Right. And I think we need to do something more. And I don't have a lot of time and I can get off. So I don't got to solve the problem. I can just talk about the problems and leave. That's the great thing about panels.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think what we're talking about is diversity is also taking in consideration the experience that people have, and that sometimes people bring in experiences that they've had that cannot be credentialized, and that needs to be considered. I think that's what we're really talking about.
So one of the concrete examples of this that comes to mind is an experience I recently had with review panels related to NASA. So you want to point a $1 billion telescope in space at something, you better know what you're doing. And anyone in the world can submit one of these proposals. You don't have to be from any particular country or institution or anything like that. And we get proposals that are like, let's point the telescope at the sun. Let's just do it. And those get rejected on like scientific and safety grounds, right? And the review process moved to an anonymized version over the last handful of years based on research coming out of psychology and studies of how science is done. And this was great. It led to a real increase in the number of first-time PIs, women PIs, and junior career PIs in a way that we just weren't seeing before. It was wonderful. After the proposals are ranked, there's the de-anonymization process. You get to see the institutions, the background, what the team said about their expertise. There has never been a single case, not one, where the team's expertise was challenged. And the institution takes that as the process is working. And to some extent, that's true, but it's also a statement about who has access to the resources and education needed to speak to the audience of panelists, right, who ranked the proposals initially. And this is getting to Brandon's point, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that conversation, because I feel like it's this kind of out of the box thinking that we're gonna need to adapt to this current situation. We're getting close to the end of our time and we can never get to all the questions, so I apologize to the people we had to miss. But we have a question in the chat that I think is probably a good place to wrap up. And I see this question coming up in different versions, kind of in every forum I'm in. All this adaptation, all this change, all this stress of watching the iceberg, we're being called upon to continue to teach our students and support them in building critical thinking. We're, for those of us who are committed to DEI, we're trying to do that. We're trying to support our students who are probably facing this in a more intense way than we are. How do we do all those things and not face burnout?
Well, I think I should start that one. So yeah, I speak about this everywhere I go, because we are burned out. I don't think it's how do we prevent burnout, is how do we ensure we don't reach the level of burnout where we can't function anymore. And the way to do that and to try to move like further away from the burnout is to focus on the bigger picture and focus on the reason that we entered this field in the first place, which is everyone has an answer for that. But in general, most of the people who are doing work in DEI, it's because we want to help our communities. We want to amplify voices that have not been heard. And we need to focus that is our mission. That is what we were going to do. And we'll have obstacles in the way, but, focus on the little things you achieve, celebrate all the little steps that you take towards that goal, and build community. Have people who think the way that you think around you, and so that you can have that support group that will take your place when you feel you need a break, and that then you can come back and continue doing this work we're doing.
So one thing I'll add to that is we talk a lot about building community within scientific spaces and things like that. I think it is just as important, especially to cope with the fact that I am burned out, to build community outside of it and outside of the university context. Like this, this place is not all of us, and we don't owe it all of ourselves either. And that's how I personally protect myself to the extent that I can.
Yeah, no, quick, old and grumpy. It's gonna be when you dedicate yourself to things, it's gonna be harder. Like that's just a fact, right? And in the generations in the past, again, probably had it much harder and complained a lot less. And I'm inspired by that. That's my personal motivation. Every time I feel frustrated or you have to push, that's the way it is. I think cool and hip is exactly what Sean said, and that is right. Like who are the people that love you? Who are the people that you love? What are the things that make you happy? Formally work that into your profession. Make that a formal part of your identity, right? This is how you actually live a full life. And doing this sort of work is fun. And when you get out of it, it's better than just sitting around all day and doing the job the way everybody else does it. So there's the payoff emotionally is so much greater.
Well, I appreciate all that good advice. We all need to hear that, I think. And I want to let the panelists know, in case they haven't been following the chat, we're seeing a lot of comments in the chat of people just appreciating the chance to hear your wisdom and saying that they want to share it with colleagues. So I want to join the audience in thanking you for all this wisdom. And I want to thank the audience for spending some of their day with us today. I want to end by asking the audience a favor. Could you take a few minutes to complete our post-event survey? It's very brief. It'll pop up in your browser at the end of this session. And I hope that we will see you at future events. It's been great to have you here with us today. Thank you all.